The winter of 1990–91 was pretty busy on the world stage, but away from the media spotlight, early in November Tim Berners-Lee made a formal proposal for something he was now calling the World Wide Web, and one of the first web pages was coded as proof of concept. On November the 19th, the leaders of Canada, the US and 32 European states all met in Paris to mark the official end of the Cold War and sign the Charter of Paris for a New Europe, made official 2 days later. In December, the last European holdout of communism crumbled as Ramiz Alia, leader of isolationist Albania, announced free elections for the spring after massive demonstrations. One of the leaders present in Paris, Margaret Thatcher, did so while awaiting the results of a leadership challenge, as the more pro-Europe Michael Heseltine stood against her. Thatcher had become increasingly unpopular in the country at large, particularly over the poll tax issue, while her combative and abrasive leadership style infuriated many within her party. With a general election expected in 1992, Heseltine had been chosen as a stalking horse to see if there was an appetite for a change in leadership among the party. During the Paris conference, the result was announced. Thatcher had defeated Heseltine, but not by enough to be immediately reconfirmed as leader, and a second round of voting would be held. On her return from Paris, Thatcher announced that she would not stand in the second round, effectively ending her premiership, which she had held for the entire 1980s after winning the 1979 general election. The second ballot took place later in November, and Chancellor of the Exchequer John Major won as Thatcher was driven from number 10 in tears, feeling that she had been stabbed in the back by her own party. A week after John Major took office, the UN Security Council passed a resolution authorising military intervention to remove Iraqi forces from Kuwait if they hadn't left voluntarily by January the 15th. Saddam released some Western hostages on December the 6th, but seemed otherwise unwilling to leave Kuwait without negotiating some concessions, while the US and UK position was that no negotiations could take place until withdrawal had happened. A last-minute French proposal to have a big international conference to sort the whole thing out having been rejected, Operation Desert Shield became Operation Desert Storm, as the coalition forces crossed the border into Kuwait to begin its liberation. In the end, 42 countries around the world contributed either military forces or support, including Germany and Italy, both making their first foreign military deployments since the end of World War II, mostly in the shape of aircraft. The war began with a huge air campaign during which the distinctive stealth fighter, the F-117 Nighthawk, first came to public attention, but things were complicated when Iraqi forces began lobbing SS-1B missiles, codenamed Scud, into Israel in the hope of baiting them into joining the war and fracturing the uneasy alliance of Muslim nations. With mobile launchers and a lot of desert to keep track of, coalition Air Force pilots ended up spending a lot of time flying very low-level Scud hunts, while the US supplied its Patriot anti-missile system to Israel on the condition that she not retaliate against Iraq. After a month of heavy air attacks, the ground forces moved in, sweeping aside Iraqi opposition with relatively few casualties, taking just over 100 hours to reach the Iraq-Kuwait border and declare a ceasefire. Estimates vary, but it is thought that anywhere up to 50,000 Iraqi soldiers were killed during those hours for the loss of 292 coalition soldiers, almost half from friendly fire incidents. While the coalition forces had freely operated in and over Iraq itself during the campaign, the decision was taken not to continue to Baghdad and depose Saddam Hussein, amid fears that going beyond the UN remit in this way would backfire and lose the support of the other regional powers, so the coalition forces moved into Kuwait or back across the Saudi border. There was another problem to deal with too. Retreating Iraqi forces had opened the taps on Kuwaiti oil wells and set them on fire, creating not only an apocalyptic landscape but an environmental catastrophe and a huge problem for the returning Kuwaiti government, as their main export was literally going up in smoke. While all that was going on, British and French contractors met 40 metres below the sea as the Channel Tunnel broke through, connecting Great Britain physically to the mainland of Europe for the first time in human history. Haiti held its first general election in decades and arguably its first free election ever, under the eyes of UN monitors, in which Jean-Bertrand Aristide became the first ever elected president after the removal of Jean-Claude Baby-Doc Duvalier, who had succeeded his father François Papa-Doc Duvalier, who had taken power in 1957. The small Yugoslav Republic of Slovenia held an independence referendum with 94.8% of votes on a 93.3% turnout voting yes, while elsewhere in the Federation, Croatia adopted a new constitution and Serbia elected nationalist Slobodan Milosevic as its new leader. Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia all voted to declare their own independence from the Soviet Union. Lithuania was the first and was immediately recognised by Iceland, but nobody else, but the Soviet government refused to allow them to leave, arguing that there was a process for succession in the Soviet constitution and that they should follow that. The Lithuanian government argued, not unreasonably, that the US hadn't exactly followed the constitution when they militarily annexed the country in 1940. And just a few days before the F1 season began, police in Los Angeles were filmed beating up motorist Rodney King. George Holliday, who took the video, found no interest at LAPD headquarters, so he instead took it to KTLA Television, who rightly recognised it as dynamite, and it was aired both whole and in clips several times in the coming days. There had actually been talk, how seriously is not clear, but it was widely reported, of cancelling or at least delaying the start of the F1 season, the feeling being that not only did it not look great to be jetting around the world having fun in the middle of a war and fuel crisis, but the febrile international atmosphere would lead to a greater threat of terror attacks. But with the war seemingly all over and done with, nothing ever came of the idea, and things carried on as usual. There were some minor technical regulation changes to try and reduce overall aerodynamic grip, making wings and overhangs smaller and raising the height of the cars, along with an increase in the minimum weight and more stringent safety tests. But the real change was in the points scoring. First off, the points for a win was raised from 9 to 10, meaning that it was no longer better to get a second and a third than a win, and the much disliked best 11 rule was binned, so every result would now count. The calendar was exactly the same as in 1990, though two races would have new venues. The French Grand Prix moved from Paul Ricard to a brand new circuit at Magny-Cours in central France, while the Spanish race moved away from Jerez to the, again brand new, Circuit de Catalunya, just outside Barcelona, which was preparing to host the 1992 Summer Olympics. Silverstone, while still hosting the British Grand Prix, had also been extensively remodelled and drivers were keen to have a go on the new track. 3 teams, consisting of 5 cars in total, Life, Eurobrunn and Onyx, had withdrawn since the start of the 1990 season, but there were 2 new 2-car teams on the grid for 1991, so with an entry list of 34, pre-qualifying was reinstated. So let's have a look at the runners and riders as the 45th season of Formula 1 racing gets underway. McLaren Honda. Back to numbers 1 and 2, and on the surface, with Honda power and Senna and Berger at the wheel, it's more of the same, but under the familiar Marlboro branding, a lot has changed. There's a new chassis, the MP46, designed by a team led by Neil Oatley, and a new engine, the V12 Honda RA12E, run through a manual gearbox developed in conjunction with Weissman. The car was tested extensively, mostly by Gerhard Berger, and he found the V12 ironically down on power compared with last year's V10, a problem exacerbated by the extra weight. The team and Honda will no doubt be working hard to solve the problems, but there are some long faces at Woking, and everyone's being politely cautious so far. Car 1, Ayrton Senna. Now a double champion, Senna will be gunning for a 3rd title to equal his great rivals Nelson Piquet and Alain Prost, and will be hoping that the MP46 will be the car to deliver him that. He developed a good rapport with Gerhard Berger, and indeed a low-level prank war had developed between the two, culminating in the Austrian setting off a fire hose in Senna's room at 3 a.m. on the morning of the Australian Grand Prix. Senna looks more relaxed and happy than ever, though no less driven and focused. He is definitely the man to beat in 1991, as long as the car is right. Car 2, Gerhard Berger. Gerhard was an asset to the team off the track in 1990, providing great testing feedback and acting as a calm, laid-back presence in the garage, in contrast to his predecessor Prost. He will, however, be disappointed not to have got himself a win after 3 successful years at Ferrari. Part of that was the early teething troubles with fitting him into the MP45 chassis, designed around the diminutive Prost, and with a new car built with his lanky frame in mind, he might have a bit better luck. Tyrrell Honda. Last year's iconic Stuka Winged 019 chassis honestly looked better than it went, but the team are convinced that the high-nose principle is sound, and this year's car, designed again by Harvey Postlethwaite and George Wrighton, has kept the idea, though the vertical struts being black now it looks much less obvious. In the back is the Honda RA101 V10 that McLaren raced to such good effect in 1990, maintained by subsidiary Mugen. Unusually for Tyrrell, they begin the season with a solid title sponsorship in place too, electrical appliance firm Braun, so the only question really is whether Pirelli have improved their race tyres in the off-season. In the driver's seat, Satoru Nakajima is, with the best will in the world, not going to win Tyrrell any races, and while Stefano Modena is widely regarded as talented, he's never been given a car good enough to show us what he can do. Car 3, Satoru Nakajima. Entering his 5th year of Formula 1 at the age of 37, Nakajima is unlikely to improve on his reputation for being a safe, steady but uninspired pair of hands. However, his good officers have helped bring Tyrrell their potentially game-changing engine deal, and if he can give them good development feedback and bring the car home in the points every now and then, he'll have done a good job. Car 4, Stefano Modena. Modena has been touted as a star of the future since he first appeared in F1 with a couple of one-off drives in 1987. A dispiriting 1988 with Eurobrunn and a frustrating 2 years at a stuttering Brabham team have dented that reputation despite his podium in Monaco 89, so he'll be hoping that the Tyrrell-Honda combination can finally give him the chance he's been denied so far. Williams-Renault. After 2 years underachieving with a decent car, Frank and Patrick have made what they hope are 2 key signings, most highly publicised being the return of Nigel Mansell to the team with which he came within an ace of winning the title in 1986 and 87. But potentially even more important is that of designer Adrian Newey, poached from the struggling Leighton House squad during the summer. That was early enough that the new FW14 is largely his baby. A basically completely new design, with his trademark slippery aerodynamics, but also including a semi-automatic gearbox, not Mansell's favourite bit of kit recently, it must be said. Testing times are good, and it's the most technologically advanced car out there. The team have promised Mansell a car in which he can challenge for the title, so now they need to deliver. The team arrive in Phoenix with a new livery with a white airbox for their Canon sponsorship as the team play hardball in their negotiations with Camel. Car 5, Nigel Mansell. Mansell had become thoroughly identified with the Williams team during his previous stint there, and despite being taken to the hearts of the Tifosi, he never quite seemed happy in the Ferrari team, especially with the arrival of Alain Prost in 1990, coinciding with a season of bad luck and reliability, such that he even announced his retirement in the summer, and despite being wooed by several teams, it was his good relationship with Frank Williams and Patrick Head, plus assurances of number 1 status and a title-winning car, that finally tempted him to change his mind. Car 6, Riccardo Patrese. The veteran Italian has driven more races than anyone else and begins his 14th season in the sport, over 200 races but just 3 wins to his name. He evidently works well in the Williams setup, and indeed his move to the Williams team, controversial at first, has seen a vast improvement in form from his mid-80s days at Brabham and Alfa Romeo. With a truly competitive car, he might do even better. Brabham Yamaha. It became increasingly obvious in 1990 that the Judd engines, initially successful on their debut, had fallen behind in performance, but even then, it's a bit of a gamble on Brabham's part to sign up for Yamaha engines. Their previous attempt, the OX88, was widely regarded as the brick that sank the Zaxbyed team. The new OX99 is a powerful V12, at least on paper, but we'll see how it goes. A new chassis, the BT60, is in the works, but for the first 2 flyaway rounds the team will have to persist with the BT59, now the BT59Y, which comes with a new red, white and blue livery. The first time red's been seen on a Brabham, by the way, since the Martini days of the late 70s. British fans are delighted to see Martin Brundle returning to the paddock with the team, and he will be paired with sports car driver Mark Blundell, much to the consternation of commentators everywhere. Car 7, Martin Brundle. The Norfolk driver has been in and out of F1 for some time, clearly talented but frustrated by never having the machinery to prove it. After Tyrrell and Zaxbyed and a stint driving sports cars in 1988, he drove for Brabham in 1989, but then opted to spend 1990 back in sports cars, winning the Le Mans race. Now in 1991, he returns to Brabham for another bite of the cherry. He's said in the past that he's just not interested in touring around at the back and struggling to qualify, so clearly he at least is positive about Brabham's chances. Car 8, Mark Blundell. Londoner Blundell began racing on 2 wheels and was one of the best young riders in the UK before moving to cars and Formula Ford at the age of 14. Finding quick success, he moved swiftly through Formula Ford 1600, then Formula Ford 2000, again doing well, though never quite managing to take the title. No matter, he skipped Formula 3 and went straight on to F3000 in 1987 and was picked up by the series heavyweight The Works Lola team for 1988, as well as testing sports cars. In 1989 he was testing F1 cars for Williams too, and concentrating on his sports car career, In 1990 he became the youngest driver ever to take pole at Le Mans, though he lost the race to his new teammate Martin Brundle. The lad certainly has promise. Footwork Porsche. Arrow's Ford is dead, long live Footwork Porsche. In fact, engine aside, it's broadly the same package, with Alboreto and Caffi behind the wheel and the same management team. Unfortunately, while the team looked like they'd scored a coup by snaffling the Porsche engine deal out from under the noses of Jean-Pierre Van Rossum and Onyx, the development has been rather problematic. The V12 was late being completed, and once all the extra bits were installed, it was not only a good 30 kilos heavier than the Ferrari and Honda V12, but so big it didn't fit in the back of the new FA12 chassis being designed for it. So while the FA12 is hurriedly redesigned, the team take to the track in the 1989 vintage A11, which had been adapted to test the engine during 1990. Car 9, Michele Alboreto. Alboreto's 1990 had not been spectacular, but it was seen as a developmental year for the team, with an old chassis and a sense of waiting on the collaboration with Porsche. Nonetheless, the car was reliable if not fast, and Alboreto often managed to qualify well and finish in the top 10. He has gelled well in the team, and if he feels like he's on a bit of a come-down from his Ferrari days, he's not showing it. At 34, he's unlikely to be picked up by a top team again, but if the Porsche package delivers, he can at least position himself to go into the end phase of his career with his head held high. Car 10, Alex Caffi. The young Italian has never quite delivered on his promise, not that he's really had much chance with the cars under him, but he had a solid 1990 and finished consistently in the top 10, as well as scoring the team's only points with 5th place in Monaco. Perhaps more than Alboreto, Caffi needs the 1991 season to go well for him, to maintain the upward momentum of his career and bring him to the notice of the big boys. Lotus Judd. The 1989 and 90 seasons had been so disastrous for the venerable Team Lotus that they'd lost both drivers, engine and main sponsor, and the Chapman family, who retained the ownership of the team, had finally had enough and were planning to wind the team up over the winter. In the end, a management buyout headed by Peters, Wright and Collins bought the team to keep it running. With no sponsorship and no funds, the dreadful 102 chassis continues with some minor tweaks to bring it within regulations, and a Judd V8 in the back. Much lighter but less powerful than the Lamborghini V12 the car was designed around. One of the first teams to go with sponsor liveries as far back as the 60s, the new sponsor-free livery is actually rather smart, white as a blank sponsor canvas, but with panels of yellow-lined British Racing green. On driving duties are 1988 Tyrrell driver Julian Bailey and British F3 champion Mika Hakkinen. Car 11, Mika Hakkinen. Karting since the age of 5, young Mika won his first race 2 years later and went on to great domestic success, before moving into car racing in 1987, purchasing a Reynard Formula Ford car from one JJ Leto and entering the Formula Ford Festival at Brands Hatch. The following year he placed second in the Formula GM Lotus Euro Series, before winning the Formula Opel Lotus Euro Series the same year. In 1989 he was driving F3, but it wasn't until a move to West Surrey Racing in 1990 that he took the British F3 title, ahead of fellow Finn and childhood friend Mika Salo. At the end of the year he entered the Macau Grand Prix, where he won the first race from pole and would have won the event overall if he hadn't had a collision with German F3 champion Michael Schumacher. Testing at Benetton in 1989 he lapped faster than Sandro Nannini, although he found it difficult to actually fit in the car. He has a lot of promise, and for 1991 Lotus took a punt on him, despite him having not gone through Formula 3000. Car 12, Julian Bailey. Bailey's first stint in F1 with the Tyrrell team back in 1988 had not been a success, with just 6 starts and 4 finishes. He looked rather out of his depth and was distinctly shown up by teammate Jonathan Palmer. Since then he'd been driving sports cars alongside Martin Donnelly and Mark Blundell, and had been part of some successful drives which enabled him to raise sponsorship and interest for a second crack at Formula 1. He would just have to hope that the 1991 Lotus was a better steed than the 1988 Tyrrell, and that 2 years out hadn't left him too rusty. Fondmetal Ford. Another team undergoing a change of name and ownership, as Enzo Ozella sold the remaining shares in his team to alloy wheels magnate Gabriele Rumi, who renamed the team after his Fondmetal firm and moved the headquarters to Bergamo, though most elements of the team remained the same, including the FA1ME chassis originating in 1989. Engines are hand-me-downs from Tyrrell last year, with preparation by Brian Hart's team, and Olivier Gouillard continues on driving duties. It's definitely going to be a transition year with a new chassis plan for later on, and Gabriele Rumi apparently prepared to spend money, but the question will be if they can survive long enough to turn things around. Car 14, Olivier Gouillard. The Frenchman had driven his first season in 1989 alongside Arnoux at Ligier and seemed to have learned many of the veteran's bad habits, gaining a justified reputation as a mobile hazard, often seeming to deliberately balk drivers attempting to lap him, with Mansell falling victim a couple of times during 1990. After 2 years in distinctly substandard machinery, it's still difficult to know if he's actually any good or not. His qualifying performances have been decent at least. Leighton House Ilmore. After making waves in 1988, the Miami Blue team had gone through tough times in 89 and 90, with only occasional bright spots like that sensational result in France 1990 to show for it. Losing talented designer Adrian Newey to Williams over the summer won't help their morale, and this year's car, the CG911, is designed by Chris Murphy and Gustav Brunner. The driving team is the same too, but in the back is a new engine by Ilmore, a company founded by Mario Ilian and Paul Morgan in 1983, which has had success in the last few years supplying engines to IndyCar teams. A new V10 engine had been built specially for F1, with rumoured backing from Mercedes, so the team will be hoping for instant success rather than the usual new engine teething troubles. Car 15, Maurizio Gugelmin. A troubled 1990 saw Gugelmin fail to qualify 4 times in the first 6 races, and although he ran second to Ivan Capelli for much of the French Grand Prix, he didn't even get a result there due to car failure, and ended the season with just 1 point. Nonetheless, very little of that was his fault. The car was just dreadful, and usually he ran well enough before he broke down. After 3 years at the March Leighton House squad, he will be looking to kick on though, and come out from under the shadow of the flamboyant Capelli. Car 16, Ivan Capelli. Like Gugelmin, Capelli suffered early in the season from a basic lack of speed, and after France from a basic lack of reliability. Unlike his teammate, he had the luck on his side, and was able to parlay a great performance at Paul Ricard into a podium place, his only points of the season, and with a little more luck could have won. Nonetheless, he showed that he has a level head in the cockpit, and despite the results not being there, his stock has still risen further. AGS Ford. Well, you can't fault their commitment. The French garagistes struggle on into 1991 with last year's car and engine, which only made the grid 9 times and only finished 3, with Dalmas's 9th place in Spain the highlight, such as it was. Yannick has moved on to sports car racing, feeling that he's still never quite gotten over his bout of Legionnaire's disease, but the team have retained the services of the talented but underused Gabriele Tarquini and brought in the experienced Stefan Johansson. Car 17, Gabriele Tarquini. The Italian begins his 3rd season with the AGS team, to whom he has given so much for so little reward. A frustrating 1990 season saw him only see the checkered flag once, 15th in Hungary, but if everyone else has forgotten his early 1989 form, the team obviously hasn't. It's a shame, though, that his evident talent hasn't been more widely recognised. Car 18, Stefan Johansson. For a brief, glorious moment in 1989, it looked like the Onyx team might be Johansson's ticket to an unlikely F1 comeback. Instead, he was forced out of the team early on in 1990, which may have been a blessing in disguise in the end. AGS are unlikely to provide a fresh start, but it's a job, and he should provide them with some solid feedback and a safe pair of hands. Benetton Ford. A new look for Benetton, as heavy camel sponsorship emphasises the yellow, with blue and green highlights and red disappearing entirely. The team will start the season with their B190 car upgraded to B-spec, with the new B191 being worked on by John Barnard, Mike Coughlin and Rory Byrne, and due to be ready for the European rounds. The team go into the new season on a high after back-to-back wins at the end of 1990, with an all-Brazilian lineup at the wheel. Nelson Piquet joined again by his old friend Roberto Moreno, delighted to win a permanent move after his successful substitution last year. News is good from Italy too, with Sandro Nannini recovering well and hoping to be back in action soon. The team will hope to maintain form at least and even start to challenge more seriously for wins. Car 19, Roberto Moreno. Few F1 careers, Keke Rosberg perhaps or Stefan Johansson, have turned around quite as quickly as Moreno's. Slogging through most of 1990 to no avail in the execrable Eurobrun, he'd just lost his job when the team folded, when by pure coincidence he was at Benetton's factory when the news about Nannini's accident came through and he was offered the drive. And Moreno grabbed the chance with both hands to take a fine 2nd place on his team debut and was unfortunate not to score in Australia too. He now needs to prove that that wasn't a fluke and that he has what it takes at the top level. Car 20, Nelson Piquet. The 3 times champion looked reinvigorated at Benetton in 1990 after 2 dispiriting years at Lotus, and whether it was his pay-per-points contract or just the joy of having a competitive car once more, he certainly regained his mojo. It was good to see the irrepressible Rio native smiling again. Can he retain his momentum? Win more races in 1991? Even mount an unexpected outside title tilt. Anything is possible if the car is right and he's in the right frame of mind. BMS Scuderia Italia Dallara Judd. 1990 had not been a vintage year for Scuderia Italia, with Pirro and De Cesaris failing to trouble the scorers all season. Reliability was the major issue, but there was also a lack of raw speed that saw the team drop into pre-qualification. With De Cesaris making his now annual move to another team, in comes talented and well-backed Finn JJ Leto, a refugee from the Onyx Monteverde farce. In also comes an exclusive supply of John Judd's new V10 engines after their previous works teams Brabham and Leighton House both jumped ship. The new motor looks in testing to be developing plenty of power at least, and with that and a brand new F191 chassis plus 2 talented drivers, they'll be hoping to improve on last year. Car 21, Emanuele Pirro. Pirro had had a particularly torrid 1990, missing the opening 2 races and some pre-season testing with a bout of hepatitis. He never really found his feet in the F190 and made many unforced errors, which, in combination with the car's unreliability, meant he only saw the checkered flag 3 times. He will look to put the year behind him and rise to the challenge of his new highly rated teammate. Car 22, JJ Leto. The Finn had been one of the few to come out of the Onyx saga with much dignity intact, and although the results had not been there, everyone knew that was hardly his fault. He had, after all, driven several races with the drive shaft fitted the wrong way round, while Gregor Wojtek, son of a major shareholder, somehow seemed to get all the best equipment. A fresh start at an ambitious team could be just the shot in the arm his career needs. Minardi Ferrari. Giancarlo Minardi's little team had established themselves as a fixture in midfield during 1989, but slipped back somewhat in 1990, failing to score during the season, and with Paolo Barilla in particular underperforming. For 1991, however, the team has become the first ever to receive customer engines from Ferrari, albeit the 1989 vintage Tipo 036 initially, and will be hoping that these, mounted in a new M191 chassis and driven by team talisman Martini and promising youngster Morbidelli, will turn things around. The new colour scheme is rather nice too, though perhaps not as eye-catching as the previous effort. Car 23, Pierluigi Martini. The diminutive Italian had had a better season than his teammate in 1990, but the M190 was just too slow to really allow him to shine. In 89 he'd even led a race, briefly, but spent most of 1990 so far down the order, or broken down, that there was no chance to repeat the feat. Nonetheless, both spectators and team know that there's more to Martini, and he'll be hoping that the new Minardi setup and Ferrari engines will help the team advance once more. Car 24, Gianni Morbidelli. The youngster clearly has promise. Ferrari don't just give anyone the official test berth, and will know the car's new engine well. It's still too early to judge his race performance on just 4 outings, 2 for Dallara and 2 for Minardi in 1990, both in pretty average cars, but he qualified for 3 of them and finished 2, and looked generally at ease in the paddock. And tellingly, looked better than Paolo Barilla ever had. Could be one to watch for the future, but the jury's still out. Ligier Lamborghini. The French team had had a rough couple of years, with the JS33 chassis not delivering in the hands of some, let's be honest, pretty average drivers like Olivier Gouillard, Philippe Alliot and a fading René Arnoux. For 1991, the team will hope to turn a corner with a new car, the JS35, and 2 new drivers, Belgian Thierry Boutsen and French rookie Eric Comas. The team, with the assistance of the French president and old mate of Guy Ligier, François Mitterrand, have secured for 1992 onwards a supply of Renault engines, so 1991 will be a transitional year with the Chrysler-supported Lamborghini V12, an engine that looked good in the Larousse Lola car, but distinctly average in the Lotus. Let's see what Ligier can do with it. Car 25, Thierry Boutsen. There's a slight feeling around the paddock that Boutsen has blown it, that the quiet, unassuming Belgian has had 2 years at Williams and 2 at Benetton before that and just never quite looked like fulfilling the promise he'd shown. Perhaps he'd flattered to deceive, perhaps he was just too laid back and lacked a cutting edge, or perhaps he'd just been unlucky in the machinery he'd had. 2 wins at Williams are some consolation at least, particularly Hungary in 1990 when he fended off Ayrton Senna to take a commanding win. He may now be on a downward trajectory, but perhaps could yet surprise. Eric Comas. Another product of the Elf Pilote scheme, which had helped many French youngsters into racing during the 1980s. Comas started karting at the relatively late age of 19, but quickly switched to car racing by buying a chassis from local boy Jean Alesi. Progressing rapidly through the French domestic scene, he was picked up by the successful Dams team to bring into F3000 for the 1989 season. He won 2 races to come second to that man Alesi in his rookie season, and then dominated the 1990 season with 4 wins to take the title. A hot prospect for the future, the French national team beckoned. Ferrari. Last year's 641 chassis was pretty good, at least the equal of the McLaren and possibly better in some situations. Reliability was a problem, particularly for Mansell, but the team have produced a 1991 car, the 642, which is an incremental development in the hope of improving reliability without changing too much of what was working, still looking for that first driver's title since Jody Scheckter back in 1979. The loyal fans had taken Mansell to their hearts after his gutsy drives and are looking forward to seeing the exciting Jean Alesi in action too. Car 27, Alain Prost. With a winter to reflect on his championship challenge in 1990, Prost would probably accept that, even without the Suzuka incident, he'd left himself a lot to do in the last few races and had an outside chance at best. Prost and Mansell always rubbed each other the wrong way, perhaps inevitable when you have 2 drivers who both think they should have number 1 status, and the team are hoping that he will see young Alesi as a protégé rather than a threat. Car 28, Jean Alesi. The young Frenchman fairly exploded onto the scene in 1989 with his substitute drives for Tyrrell and continued making headlines through 1990, even if he never quite repeated the heroics of Phoenix, where he diced with Senna for the lead. The Tifosi are agog to see what he'll do in the iconic red cars. He's exactly the sort of aggressive, exciting driver they love, and his Italian heritage doesn't hurt either. He should win races in 1991 and even mount a title challenge if all goes well for him. It's hard to believe that we're talking about a driver embarking on just his second full season in F1. LaRousse Lola Ford. The LaRousse team had had their best ever season in 1990, culminating in Aguri Suzuki's famous third-place finish at his home race in Japan. But then, disaster. FISA announced that the team had registered the constructor's name as LaRousse, while the chassis were actually being built by Lola, and therefore they were disqualified from the season. After frantic representations to the FIA, they were able to convince the governing body that a genuine mistake rather than any chicanery was involved, and the resulting compromise was that while the points would still be struck from the record, the team would keep the travel benefits and prize money and would not drop into pre-qualifying. Not ideal, but better than nothing, and the team could look forward to 1991. Gone were the powerful but fickle Lamborghini V12s, and a supply of Hart engines had been arranged, but early in the year Japanese backers Espoo withdrew, causing the deal to fall through. New sponsor Central Park, another Japanese property firm, came in, and the good old Ford DFR V8s were arranged, with Lola producing a new LC91 chassis for them. On driving duties, Eric Bernard and Aguri Suzuki continued with the team. Car 29, Eric Bernard. Bernard's first full season in F1 had been fairly successful, all things considered. Aguri Suzuki may have made headlines with his podium finish in Japan, and compatriot Alesi may have hogged even more limelight, but Bernard scored twice and acquitted himself well despite mechanical unreliability. He'll be keen to show in 1991 that he is no second fiddle to Suzuki. Car 30, Aguri Suzuki. Suzuki had had the better season of the 2 LaRousse drivers in 1990, with 3 sixth places and then that famous third-place finish at his home race. Sure, home advantage, and the Senna and Prost incident plus other retirements helped him a lot, but he'd been setting fastest laps late on, and it was just reward for his talent and hard work. With Satoru Nakajima surely nearing the end of his career, Suzuki is set to become Japan's hero in a sport the country is mad for. He will hope to showcase his talent to some top teams. Coloni Ford. After a pretty dreadful 1990, the Coloni squad took a deep breath and got ready for the upcoming season. The old C3C chassis was handed over to the University of Perugia, whose students worked on it and produced the updated C4. An unusual method, but it had the advantage of being cheap, and the sponsor-free team was desperately strapped for cash. It's hard to see how the team can make much headway in 1991, but likewise they can't go much further backwards. Last year they were only kept off the bottom by the even worse Eurobrunn and Life teams. In the driver's seat comes Portuguese rookie Pedro Chaves, who brings with him some personal sponsorship from winemakers Mateus. Car 31, Pedro Chaves. Porto native Chaves becomes Portugal's third ever F1 driver and the first with a full-time drive. He began karting in 1980 and progressed well through the domestic scene before moving up to Formula Ford 1600 in 1986. Winning the Portuguese and Iberian titles, he moved to Britain to continue his career, doing well enough in 1987 and 88 to make the jump straight to Formula 3000. He struggled with the step up, but was spotted by Nigel Mansell, who offered him a spot with his Madgwick Motorsports team for 1990. Pedro romped away with the 1990 British F3000 title and also entered several rounds of the International F3000 series, scoring 3 points. Clearly a talent for the future, and with F1 becoming ever more popular in his native Portugal since racing came to Estoril, several Portuguese firms have sponsored him into F1 in the hopes that Coloni would provide a stepping stone to greater things. Jordan Ford. Eddie Jordan had briefly been a driver himself, but in the early 1980s he formed his own team, Eddie Jordan Racing, entering in the Formula 3 series and proving immediately successful. In 1983, Jordan driver Martin Brundle and former Jordan test driver Ayrton Senna conducted a fantastic scrap throughout the season, and in 1987 Johnny Herbert won the title with them as they made the step up into F3000. Jordan and Herbert formed a great partnership until Herbert's accident at Brands Hatch. EJR driver John Alesi cleared up in 1989, but in 1990, perhaps distracted by preparing for F1, results fell away, with Eddie Irvine managing third overall and Heinz-Harald Frentzen and Emanuele Naspetti managing just 4 points between them. Eddie will continue a presence in F3000, this year running Vincenzo Sospiri and Damon Hill, but his main focus will be on F1. The beautiful Jordan 191 chassis, it was originally going to be designated the 911 but Porsche objected, had been drawn up by Gary Anderson and his team. Eddie Jordan had been sponsored by Camel throughout the last few successful years in F3000, but with the cigarette firm going all in on Williams and Benetton, a new sponsor was required and 7up came on board as main sponsor. The car painted a very fetching and appropriate Irish green with blue side pods. The car was originally designed for the Judd V8, but after a chance meeting at a sponsor event, the ever-charismatic Eddie Jordan arranged a customer supply of Ford HB A4s, the same ones used by Benetton in their B190 chassis. Driving the new machine were Bertrand Gachot and Andrea de Cesaris. Car 32. Bertrand Gachot. Despite being highly regarded as a promising driver, Bertrand Gachot had never really had much of a chance to prove it so far. Beginning with the Onyx team, thanks to the backing of erratic businessman Jean-Pierre Van Rossum, he was sacked for disagreeing with him just before the team's best race in Portugal. A dreadful 1990 in the terrible Coloni saw him fail to qualify for any race, and his stock has fallen somewhat since then. His experience with start-up teams hasn't been great, but Jordan's pedigree gives him hope for better. Car 33. Andrea de Cesaris. The Italian's stint with Dallara had been mixed. He'd stood on the podium in 1989, but also taken out his own teammate. 1990 was more anonymous, with the team slipping back from midfield, and de Cesaris seemed frustrated, reviving his reputation for crashing out or blocking faster drivers. Nonetheless, he has matured and still comes with substantial Marlboro Italia money, so with his vast experience and backing, he still looks like a good signing for a new squad. Modena Lamborghini. The origins of the Modena Lamborghini team lie in the early months of 1990 as the Glass team, a Mexican-backed effort which approached Lamborghini for a supply of engines and for assistance with chassis design. Lamborghini in turn were interested in expanding from engine supply into having their own team and seconded Mauro Forghieri and Mario Tolentino to the team to design the chassis. In mid-1990, with the chassis nearly complete, the main backer González Luna disappeared with all the money, so in order to keep things going, Lamborghini decided to invest the money themselves. However, the firm wanted to keep things at arm's length to avoid the illustrious name being attached to a high-profile flop, so the team was registered under the name Modena Racing Team, after the town where the factory was based. Sadly, driver Stefano Modena, also from Modena, was with Tyrrell. However, the entry had already been put in with Lambo as the constructor name, so the team was Modena Lamborghini, but the cars were Lambo Lamborghinis, despite not being built by an outside company like Dallara or Lola. Confused? Nicola Larini, an experienced test driver, was signed after his stint with Ligier and would partner Belgian rookie Eric van der Poel. Car 34. Nicola Larini. Larini was another driver like Gachot, with evident talent but never having had the machinery to make the most of it. Coloni, Ozella and then Ligier had all been average at best. though in 1990 he had at least managed to qualify for every race and clearly outshone his more experienced teammate Alio. The Lamborghini engine had been occasionally quite good in 1990 though, and while the new package was unlikely to win straight out of the box, it might allow him to do better. Car 35, Eric van der Poel. The Belgian driver from Verviers began life in single-seat racing, moving from karts into French F3, but also kept a sideline in touring car racing, and indeed in 1987 he won the German Touring Car Series despite not winning a race all season, as well as the Spa 24 Hours. In 1989 he moved to British F3000, finishing 4th, and was then runner-up in International F3000 to Eric Comas with 3 wins across 1990. His long-term sponsor LeasePlan decided to back him into F1 with the new Lamborghini outfit. 1991 is, by the way, the first season I watched any of, although I came in quite late on, but it's also the basis for the seminal computer game Microprose Grand Prix by Jeff Crammond, which as I suspect many people, played the print off back in the day. So, enjoy the theme music that is absolutely in no way, shape or form Fleetwood Mac's The Chain. And I'll see you in Phoenix.